know that.
As certified life coaches with 45 years combined experience in human resources, Jen Trum and Catherine Fry have both experienced the highest of highs and the lowest of lows, both personally and professionally. And what they each know to be true is this: our mental, physical, and emotional health are the essential building blocks in order to thrive and shine in the field of HR. So in a first of its kind podcast, we'll be getting real and to discuss and share what has contributed to both our struggles and successes, with the goal of inspiring women around the globe to stand tall and take the necessary action to both thrive and shine in HR. Here are your hosts, Jen and Catherine.
Welcome to Thrive and Shine HR. Today, we're going to be talking about dealing with difficult employees, and I'm so excited to dive in today with Jen. Jen, how are you?
I'm so good. How are you, Catherine, today?
I'm so good too. I cannot wait to dive into this topic. I really can. I think there's so much here. And as usual, I feel like we could talk forever on this topic. And I know, Jen, that preparing for today's podcast, we spoke a little bit on Friday. And in preparation, you always do such a great job of engaging the women in your Facebook group called the HR Women of HR Support Group, which is a phenomenal group. So any listeners out there who are not in Jen's group, get in there. It's phenomenal. So Jen, I know you really engaged your group. And you threw the question out to your group asking, in one sentence, describe the most difficult employee you've ever had to work with. So I'm just curious, when you connected with the women in your group, what did you hear? What did you see? What were your thoughts? I'm curious about all of it.
Oh my gosh, yeah. So last week we put a little poll. Well, we typically put a poll in the Women of HR support group, and I also threw it up on LinkedIn as well. And this week we did a couple different things. So we did a poll and we said, here are 4 options. What are the different types of employees, the most difficult types of employees you've ever had to work with? We had the gossiper, we had the complainer, we had, I think, backstabber. I'm trying to remember what they were. And then we also did something a little bit different this week, which I think we'll do every week, because we have such an incredible group that engages so amazingly. And so we asked the question just blanketly, right? We put it out there and said, tell us about the most difficult types of employees that you had to work with. And It blew up. So I think we are 80 plus comments, and there were some themes.
There were some themes.
So some of the biggest themes that we saw were around narcissism. So people who are engaging in behaviors that are undermining, that are backstabbing, that are gaslighting. We saw a lot of people really frustrated with gossiping and complaining and behind the back type of crap, and all of that. So a lot of threads kind of went off on that a little bit here and there. And then energy. We talked a lot about energy last week, and that came up quite a lot in the comments around negative energy. People who just are always just find the worst in everything and will find every excuse to put everything down that they could possibly think of. So yeah, it was such a great conversation. And I can't wait as we get into our own own thoughts and our own personal feelings about it. So what were some of your biggest takeaways from the poll that we did, Catherine?
Oh, well, I felt the exact same way. I saw the exact same themes that you did. It was hard not to. And what I found that was so interesting was that I got a little triggered. And when I say triggered, it's the greatest news ever, because I've done a lot of thought work. I continually do thought work. And I found it really interesting. I was like, oh my gosh, why am I getting triggered? And the responses were so fascinating to me. And we, the question was asked in a certain way of, tell us the most difficult employee. 100% of the responses were all about missed behavioral expectations in the workplace, right?
Mm.
There was not a single comment, not one. I found this so fascinating. It wasn't my salesperson missed targets. It wasn't about those classic items that we do put in job descriptions. It was about the things that never go into a job description, rarely go into an employee handbook, and yet it's something that continues to really take up a lot of time in HR.
Mm.
Whether it's employees having interpersonal difficulties, or, the question we really asked was, what is so difficult for you? And what I found was really interesting. A lot of people talked about victim mentality and the responses. The irony was that a lot of the responses were rooted in victimhood.
Yeah.
It blew my mind. And the reason, Jen, I got triggered is because I operated most of my career from a place of victimhood, and I had no idea.
Mm-hmm.
I had victim mentality. And so I got triggered because I was like, oh my gosh, this was me 5 years ago. This was me. This was me. This was me. This is why I had insomnia. This is why I emotionally ate. All of the things. So it just kind of blew my mind, and my heart went out to every single person who responded. So that was my response to the whole, it was so interesting from a sociological and ethnographic standpoint. I'm curious for you. When you think about what really has been difficult for you, what would you say that's been?
We had talked on Friday, just kind of, putting out some questions for today. And that was, as this was still blowing up. And so, as I look through that too, I didn't catch it at the time, but as you were talking right now, I was like, oh my gosh, I too got triggered for the same reasons. And
You did.
oh my gosh. Yeah. And what's so interesting is that I was coming today to share an example of my first ever office experience. So many of you may not know, I took 12 years to get my bachelor's degree. I was a dropout for a period of years. And in that time, I worked in an office for a gentleman who owned an insurance agency. And he was someone who was my first ever real boss in that way. And we'll call him JW. And JW was one of those guys that had charisma like nothing else, right? He was the insurance agent, but he was on the older side. I think he was in his late 60s. Here I was in my just hit 20, but he was in his late 60s and was so unaware of the way that he would talk to women in particular and talk down to people who were younger than him. And all of that at the time went right over my head, right? It went right over my head because at the time I just wanted to please. I just wanted to do my best. I had no idea what the hell I was doing. I was in a gap, in my life. And so I just wanted to so it's like as the gaslighting or as the talking down or the minimizing or the reducing, all of those things were happening, right? I just kept showing up without full awareness of how much it was going into me and how over the next 20 years, I then would engage in some of those same behaviors that JW would engage in with me, and not in quite the same way. But I think we then carry on, especially with those early leaders. So that to me was the thing that blew my mind as I was thinking about this and I was going through those comments and I was kind of internalizing it myself. And I said, wow, I became JW for like
Whoa.
years and years in these different ways that I would carry myself because it worked, right? The charisma, the
Yes.
sometimes talking down, that victim mentality, all of those things I think were behaviors that I carried with me. And so as now I'm looking back on that younger self, I was seeing it all over the comments. And I think it's really, really powerful now to be, where I am. And I know you feel the same way, Catherine, to be able to look at that with so much compassion and say, oh
Ah,
my gosh,
yes.
yes, that's exactly how we feel. That makes so much sense. So
It
anyway, I kind of went full
does.
circle on it, but like that first experience in that office environment set the foundation for me in so
Wow.
many subconscious ways that it's wild now to look back on it, and it's very empowering at the same time.
I mean, my mind is blown because of what you just shared. I had this very strong visual going in my head. And I started reflecting. I mean, I could like see you with J Dub. I could see you. And it's so true that we learn so much from I mean, the leaders that we work with throughout our lifetime. And I just find that
Mhm.
so fascinating. And of course, I'm flashing back to my early years of working in a basement without windows. And my office was off of another office. So I was, quite literally in a basement. And I recall a male coming into the HR office and closing the door. So we were in a remote part of the building, and I felt very, 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 very trapped. So it's just interesting that you bring up the dynamic of, an older male and a female. And I do recall somebody else. I have a couple of Facebook groups as well. And I asked a similar question, and one of the women in my group talked about, just derogatory statements made by a male in her early career. And especially early on, especially in our youth, we don't understand. Most women I know, it's that people pleasing. We're new to the work environment. We don't necessarily see and understand how we can show up, in our womanhood, in our femininity. Um, it's just an interesting time. It's a really interesting time. So it's so funny. I mean, as usual, this conversation just goes in so many different directions that I can never anticipate, which is always so fun. Always so fun. I'm curious if, when dealing with difficult employees, have you seen themes in your career that aren't necessarily getting better? I mean, are there certain aspects that you're still dealing with that you've dealt with your entire career, in other words?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely would say so, but I also truly am always an optimist at heart and believe progress is always being made.
Oh, I
And
love
so
that.
I'm one who's always going to say yes and.
I love the
Right.
yes and great book. I have it on my shelf. Great book.
But it's so true for me. I think there is so much progress and yet so much opportunity, especially when it comes to how we can really, I think, learn from ourselves. And
Ooh,
so the piece that you really brought up and that we talked about earlier about the self-awareness that we've gained over our years in HR and just in our years of being human, right? Like, and how we're showing up and how we can check in on ourselves and say, is this really how I want to be? Is this who I want to be? And that in of itself, I think, allows us to just become so much more finely tuned to
mhm.
those toxic behaviors outside of ourselves. And I think that, like, for me, that has been by and large the greatest shift. It's like I can stand up on a pedestal and I can talk about, like, act this way and do this and say this, but it really truly was not until I started walking the walk in my own life, like
Oh, I love that. Yes.
radically, right? And
Yes.
being very honest with myself about how I was showing up in integrity, that it began to shift. and now I just don't have the tolerance for it. I'm going to, love you, and I'm going to try to like challenge others in terms of their behavior. But at the end of the day, we have to own our own. And so that's, yeah, I think that that's kind of where it's been for me. And I think it's been around like this idea of like no drama, no drama in
No
my head
drama.
first, right? To make sure that I am showing up so clear-headed, and there's no drama, that then I can make sure that whatever this chaos is that's going outside of me, I can be able to be very clear that, one, it's not about me. And two, like it honestly is going to be so much easier as I can find a way to be able to make sure that I don't get triggered, right? Like that we remain untriggered. So, okay. I'm always finding these ways to bring it back to ourselves, but it's, there's no other way for me. I don't
Yeah.
know any other way. So I'm curious, what about you? What have been some of the patterns, the reoccurring things? What have you seen come up over and over again that you feel like we're continuously having to address?
Well, I think it's really interesting because I do believe that we continue to have things show up in our lives that we haven't quite learned, that we haven't dealt with, that we haven't overcome. So I find it really interesting, when you just mentioned it's always coming back to ourselves. I think dealing with difficult employees, our power move is knowing the power of our brain, understanding our brain, understanding that our thoughts inform everything. And when you talked about, sorry, I'm not answering your question because I just have, you just really like blew my mind, and you got my mind spinning in a way that I think a lot about our power move in HR is to get out of our mind drama, to really separate fact from drama. Is something true? Is it really, 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 really true? And
Mhm.
I think as HR practitioners, when we not only take that theoretical knowledge, yeah, I know I need to do that. I know I need to stay, true to fact, but actually apply it, that's when the change starts to happen. And just like you were saying with compassion, compassion's a skill. So I think as HR professionals, as HR women, as HR leaders, any HR human being, I think it does come down to that's where our personal power is. That's where our HR power is.
Mhm.
To finally answer your question, for me, I think what keeps coming up, and we saw this in the comments, is the gossip. In fact, this just happened with a client of mine last week. I actually did a rather large training for an organization. And after the training, this happens a lot. There will always be haters, so to speak, right? And there was one person in this training who had certain things that they shared in the training. They were just, if I were to say alcohol really doesn't help our mental health, this person would then say, well, alcohol really helps with connection of employees, right? So some people in that training got triggered. They thought this employee was difficult, and they started spinning out, right?
Mhm.
As
Mhm.
opposed to really staying focused on the training, they got frustrated. How could this difficult employee derail the conversation? And as opposed to going to that employee and having a conversation and understanding that employee's why. Where's
Mm.
that employee coming from? What's going on with that employee? I had several people come up to me afterwards, and I'm just gossip, right? It's gossip. When we're talking about somebody and they're not present, and we're not going directly to the person with compassion, with empathy, and saying, Todd, tell me more about that comment. What did you mean about that comment? And really taking the time to understand. I think that's one of the most valuable skills we can have as an HR person to very first like you were saying, it's not about us. It's
Mhm.
never about us. Whatever that difficult employee is saying or doing is a reflection of them. So finding out, realizing it has nothing to do with us and going directly to that person, that eliminates the gossip in the workplace. It also eliminates a lot of drama. And it's about understanding that that person is just doing what they've probably always been doing, right?
Mm.
I don't know. I found it
Yeah.
really, really fascinating and no judgment. It's all about just stepping into our curiosity 100%
Yeah.
at a time. Curious about ourselves, like, oh, this is really interesting. Like, I think what bothers us, what we find to be most difficult in employees says much more about us than about the quote unquote difficult employees. What our minds are saying says so much more about the work we have to do. I think triggers are a great thing. It just shows me that I have more work to do. It's like an aha. It's like, oh, there it is. As opposed to, oh God, it's like, aha, there it is. I just went way off on a tangent. Again,
I'm sitting here just so loving you right now. It's so
I
funny.
love
You're
it.
like, I'm off on a tangent, and I'm like, girl, it's preaching right now. Like
I
this,
know.
this I think
Oh,
is exactly why, you and I work so well. And I think this podcast works so well is because at the end of the day, it's about like our humanity and about like
yes,
really being able to like come to a place where we can understand how we could become so much better humans by
yes,
utilizing these skills. Because the example you gave is something that has come up for me and come up with every other HR person hundreds of times, right?
hundreds.
Why where we are brought a situation that is clearly gossip, that's clearly talking, about this person behind the da 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 da. And rather than going to the source, having a really challenging, probably uncomfortable, it's going to take some courage
Yes,
conversation, right?
yes.
We're going to do the easy and safe by going behind the back and, making drama. So it's like what you hit on, I think, is something that I think us in HR we struggle with, right? Like I love y'all, I love myself, but I also see it so often that it's something that we struggle with ourselves because of how uncomfortable it can be at first. Like you
Yeah.
had said in that situation, it's not really that big of a deal, right? Like, but yet these triggers that happen are really those cues. And the more that we can have the courage to like be curious, right, of those cues, the more, yeah, that we're going to really see, oh, oh, okay, I see now. I actually, right, that I got a little bit triggered in that too, right? Like the gossiping and those types of things bring back something from me. So all of that I think is, yeah, it all is related. And when it comes to dealing with difficult employees and how we can become superheroes, of our own world when it
Yeah.
comes to difficult employees, you absolutely hit the nail on the head. So I really appreciated that answer. And I second, third, and I think, everything right back that up, and everyone listening, I think, can relate to it because at the end of the day, that's exactly what it is. When it's gossip and people do not have the courage to be able to address it straightforward, those are the triggers worth investigating.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think the other big point is that no one's broken. We're not broken as human beings. The people coming in our
No.
office aren't broke. There's nothing wrong with anyone. It's just our brain. You hit the nail on the head. The brain does things and works in a way to keep us safe. It's our amygdala, it's our primal brain. So the less we judge our own brains, well, I'm just trying to stay safe. I don't want to have this conversation. I'm a people pleaser. I tend to sweep things under the rug because, I just don't want to deal anything because I don't want to make a mountain out of, all of the, what they are, excuses that
Mhm.
keep us safe. We just have to look at those with curiosity as an observer and then decide, are we exacerbating the situation? Are we judging? Or are we actually helping? What's going to move the needle to actually help all humans involved, including ourselves? I don't know. So, I mean, obviously we could talk about this forever. I'm also curious, like, because you've been in HR for so long, you have such a fascinating history of where you've gone, what you've done. And I'm curious if there are any themes that in HR dealing with difficult employees that you no longer have to deal with. Like, was it something early on in your career that no longer even comes up in terms of dealing with employees? Has something shifted in you or shifted in the profession that you've seen the needle move, so to speak?
I've definitely seen the needle move for myself. And I think, I certainly don't want to, repeat, things that I've talked about before, but I think coaching for me has been the complete game changer. And it's like, I can preach and I can say all the things about it, but I think until people experience it themselves, it's just going to sound like words. But for me, it has been life changing in every possible area of my life. The more that I have become more aware of myself and the way, my triggers would come up for me, and how then I could become so much more intentional in my relationships and how I engage with others in the world. And so I think what I've seen for me over the past, I got certified as a coach in 2021. So it's only been 3 years, but I think it was, April 2021. So I'm almost at my 3-year mark. But it's wild because when I first got certified, I was still working in HR, and then I took a break from HR to do coaching, and then I came back to HR.
Yes.
And I know I've shared this with you, but when I came back to HR, it was this cloud was lifted, and I just was able to kind of see things so clearly without getting caught in my own head about who I needed to please and how I needed to, all the drama, I think, became quieter. And I was just able to focus on the here and now. And I was able to walk into situations that were so much more like challenging for me before, And I think part of that is just that courage to get curious, the courage to say, well, wait a minute, what is that? What exactly is causing me to feel uncomfortable, to doubt myself, to worry, to have anxiety, right? And so all of these emotions that I had been feeling as a human by going through coaching, little did I know that getting certified was then going to actually help me as a human in being able to address the worry and the anxiety. So I think just as an HR professional, I would say the more that we can do to do that self-work, the more that it's going to serve everything in our lives. And the more that those clicks happen of awareness around that for each and every one of us, the more that our workplaces and our organizations and really society as a whole is going to see the shift. So I truly believe, and I know I've shared this with you before, that I believe that the HR profession is like such an underutilized superpower in so many ways. And I know that it's us, right? It's us. And we, each and every one of us, have the ability to be able to make such a massive impact. We just need to believe. So that is where, I've kind of transformed myself. And now I'd show up with this vision to serve, not with like an arrogance and not with an overconfidence, but because of a belief in myself and a belief that I know that I'm worthy. I know that everything that I'm putting out there is with good intention. I'm gonna say one last thing and then I'll wrap it up.
No, it's so good.
I was listening to Jay Shetty's On Purpose podcast, and you know how much I love Jay Shetty. That's like,
we love Jay Shetty.
And he had Ed Milet on. My first time ever listening to Ed Milet was on Jay Shetty's podcast, and now I'm obsessed. And Ed Milet was talking about how, in our lives, if we are not intentional about the energy that we're putting out there and the energy that we're surrounding ourselves in, then we are going to get absorbed by our environment. And I think in
Mm.
HR, what we don't sometimes realize or we're not fully conscious of is how much we've become absorbed within our environment rather than being able to be truly conscious of the energy and the opportunities that we have by putting our energy out in the world. And if it is not serving us in the way that we can see how, our potential, then we need to be we need to make changes. And so yeah, it was so beautiful just to be able to recognize how much strength we have when we can tap into it within. So I went way off on that, but I'm
I
just so
I
go
think
ahead.
that's the thing. I think when we experience such profound life changes, when we and maybe this is the beauty of getting older. You do have this wisdom, and I remember being younger sort of rolling my eyes at people thinking, "Oh my gosh, what is this wisdom people talk about?" And it does happen. And if you welcome it, if you allow it. Certainly, certain people go through life stuck in that survival mode versus that thrival mode, stuck
Yeah.
in the rumination, stuck in that victim mentality, stuck in that blame and shame. And that's fine. That's people's prerogative. It is what our brain is designed to do to keep us safe. There's a reason we've got that narrative going. But it sounds like what happened for you is you were able to just pop out. You learned so much in coaching school, so to speak, that you now approach HR in a totally different way. And would you say, like, you're happier? I mean, how would you describe it? How would you describe that shift? I'm just super curious.
Well, it's so funny because there's multiple things that contributed to it as well. Obviously, you know that I used to be a very heavy drinker, and after coaching over the last couple of years, that was one of the things that just had to go once
Yes.
I became so much more aware of like yeah. So I think,
Yeah.
part of it is that I had come to a place in my life where I needed to make some changes, that it was time, right? Like, I think everybody listening can relate to the
Yeah.
one or two things in their lives that they know when it's time, it's going to be time.
Yeah.
I'm not going to judge, but we know those things, right? And so
Yes.
that's what it was for me. It was like, the coaching, but then it was that, and it was also some toxic relationships in my life, and I
Mm.
really got to a place where I just became very, very intentional. And so in the time that I had left my career at Dutch Bros and was doing coffee or doing coffee, doing
Doing coffee.
coaching,
Doing
and I
coffee.
was coaching, I think that, and as you know, like the more that you help others find themselves, to really understand themselves, to like really become like so embracing of their most authentic selves, that's where, I think we have the greatest gift that we can ever give in the world, is to be able to see someone else like shine. And that then, as I'm now kind of back in this HR role, I can now look at every single person that I have the opportunity to get to work with each and every day in that way, right?
Uh,
Like, that I'm not trying to change anybody or anything like that, that I'm going to pour everything that I can into everyone, because why not? And then I'm also going to hold them very accountable for their actions and behaviors, with love, with compassion.
yes.
Like, all of that, I think, is just easier the more that we can get out of our own head, the more that we can step out of all that drama, and then we can just show up with pure loving intention. That's all it is for me now.
And how simple.
And how
How
simple.
simple. And yet complex if we don't actually apply it. I think that's the difference. You actually, going back to what you were saying earlier, you now walk your talk. You know you figured out what works for you, and you do it, and it's working. And I
Yeah,
love
and
that.
I think, for you, like, for someone who has that opportunity to be able to serve and give back to so many
Yes,
others in the field,
yes.
right? Which is like my passion, which is why we're here right now. But it's like, I think that, tell me, for you, like that progression of like how you have been able to now help people with their with the draw, like how does that help as you've grown and evolved to be able to like serve at a different level? Have you seen that shift as well?
I've seen it shift in so many ways throughout the years. What keeps popping in my head, I giggle about it a little bit. Back in the day, it was what we dealt with was a quote unquote hostile work environment. Do you remember that language of hostile work environment? Those words are
Yeah.
no longer used. Now it's bullying, it's toxicity, it's narcissism, it's micromanagement. I mean, the words keep shifting, but the issue is still the same. It's the behavior, it's the human behavior that we are judging. And I
Mm,
think the way we get out of our own way is the antidote is developing that skill of curiosity. And that's been huge for me and has also been a huge skill that as I watch my clients develop that skill, they show up differently at work. They're happier, they're more impactful, they're more inspiring. And I think the other thing, I guess the other habits I've seen shift in my life, I also no longer drink alcohol. I'm alcohol free. I noticed that, and one thing I've learned about habit change is if there is a negative consequence on the end of your habit, that's when you know that it's an issue, that it's a bad habit. So for me, if I were to drink, I'm going to have a glass of wine to deal with this difficult employee in the workplace. Woo, I just need a glass of wine to relax. For some people, that's not a big deal. If you don't wake up with a hangover, if there's no negative consequence on the end, if you don't hit the snooze button, then great. You're probably not a problem drinker. For me, I was always a little fuzzy. I didn't like that. I wasn't able to just be that best HR practitioner. So that's when I knew that, okay, here's an issue here. And I also my rumination, I'd wake up at 3 in the morning, I'd have insomnia, and I knew that that was an issue. That was a habit that was a result of me not knowing how to deal with difficult and problematic employees in the workplace. I was always ruminating about people and situations in the workplace. And I also was an emotional eater. I just would love that blood sugar spike. I would love getting, the feelings that escape through sugar. It was sugar for me. I would go to the cookies. I would go to the cakes. So it's just really interesting that I no longer have to resort to those forms of escapism, which is really, really cool. And going back to what you were saying, I don't know. I see and approach my work very differently in a much more healthy way. And I too don't, I've had to do a lot of work not to take things personally. And once you get it, you get it, you can't unsee it. And it's one of the most empowering things ever, I think. So what, do you have any strategies that you use in the workplace or, anything that you're doing differently? Any like new skills that you're teaching in the workplace to help employees help themselves, so to speak, in dealing with difficult employees? Or for you, any skill development you've worked on?
yeah, one of the things also with that Jay Shetty episode that I loved so much is they were talking about the importance of building, um, if you're going to be someone who is going to call it out, right? So one of the things that
Okay.
I really advocate for, and I really recommend to every one of us out there, is start to build your courage around calling stuff out and start to be more comfortable in that role. And what I think ends up happening for so many of us is that when we're not yet to a place where we feel really comfortable with that relationship, there's not really trust there, there's not really respect there, and you try to then call out the behavior, the actions, attitude of others, that's where you're going to have such difficulty, and where I think HR practitioners have so much difficulty. So one of the things that I've really been doing, I've been in my role now for 8 months and not even a full year,
Oh, wow.
and being totally transparent with you, I other than fires that I'm addressing in the moment,
Yeah.
the deeper behavior, attitude, mindset issues have been something that have taken time. And I've been
Mhm.
very patient, and I've been very slow intentionally with addressing some of the behavior and attitude issues. And I think that can be really hard for us as well, especially for people like me who
Mm.
have been all throughout my career. When I see it, I want to deal with it, right? Like I recognize it and I want to deal with it. But if we're not really aware at like a real core level around that type of relationship that we might have with another individual, and now we're calling things out just because we see it and we know it, now we're jeopardizing the possible respect and trust within that relationship. And I think us being really honest with ourselves in that place, we're the opportunity to be effective is like exponentially more when I think we're showing up with such like honest intentions, because we recognize that relationship is ready for it. And so, yeah, so that was something that Ed Milet shared on Jay Shetty's podcast. And it was like, I had to listen to it 3 times, because to me, that's something that we miss. And I know me personally, I've missed over and over and over in my career, is trying to give constructive or difficult feedback and not yet being in a position where that relationship has a solid foundation. And
Oh,
I get it. We don't always have an opportunity to do that. We're in HR, so trust me, ladies, I completely understand that that's not always going to be possible. However, whenever possible, it is a game changer. So for me, like, I think I was planning to talk about like, oh, meditation and mindfulness and all of that. And yes, those
which
things
is
are
huge.
really, really huge. And I still stand by those 100% when it comes to things we can do in the workplace. However, for me, my truest answer is to really, really work on those relationships, especially with the leaders that we work with that are the ones that are causing the most trouble. You know who they are. Those are the ones to become curious with. And I think what you had said earlier about curiosity is exactly it. So combining the two, that curiosity with that foundation of that relationship, I think would be an absolute game changer for anybody out there. Catherine,
Yeah.
what about you?
Well, it's funny because going, it's so interesting how you brought up walking the talk earlier. We don't, it sounds like you don't just talk the talk, you now walk the talk. You go about things differently.
Mhm.
And as opposed to saying, well, we need to develop the skill of curiosity. We need to develop our thought intelligence, which to me is the precursor to emotional intelligence. Going back to what you were saying about you need to have that willingness of your greatest offender, so to speak. So yeah, we're not saying everybody's open and ready and willing to listen about their difficulties, how others are perceiving them in the workplace, emotional intelligence, thought intelligence, all of those types of things. I totally
Mhm.
totally agree. I think that there are techniques, that coaching techniques we can utilize and that we can learn and we can master to, instead of calling people out in the workplace, we call them in. And that
Mm,
shift takes place with that curiosity. So,
yes. Gosh, that's so good. Dang.
well, it's just, it is the one thought when I think I want to call this person out, when I shift the thought to I want to call this person in,
Yeah,
I show up so differently.
completely.
Totally. And I work with an organizational leader. He is literally the person in charge, and I coach him every single week. And I shared that thought. I was like, well, what helps me is shifting into I'm going to call that person in. And he said it has been a game changer. Just
Damn,
that
that's
small
awesome.
shift, but then applying it. How am I going to call this person in? So I have quite literally gone into organizations and helped them develop a modern day learning and development curriculum that includes teaching classes on forgiveness, includes teaching classes on curiosity. So instead of just saying we need to do this, I now go in and teach it. I
Mm,
teach HR practitioners how to develop their own skill of forgiveness, how to develop their own skill of curiosity. So it takes practice. And it takes awareness and it takes observation. And it is the most powerful shift and set of tools that I've seen in the workplace with organizational leaders. It's really mind blowing. And I'm just so glad that we're living in this era where neuroscience and behavioral science has made so much progress in the last 40 to 50 years that we're seeing a shift in organizations based on the utilization of this knowledge that we didn't have before 40, 50 years ago. So I think
yeah.
we're really lucky to be living in this day and age and applying it in the workplace. I don't know. It's been the most liberating, freeing body of knowledge I've ever had in my life. And when you experience this level of freedom, this level of calm, this level of, oh my God, I no longer take things personally, the world is just your oyster. So you just want that for everybody, And I think that's where when you say, we kind of get a little preachy, it's because, at least for me, I want every HR human to actually love their career and to love their
Mhm.
life. And it is possible. It truly is. If it's possible for me, that over drinking, overeating insomniac with general anxiety disorder, it truly is possible for any. I really believe that. I really, really believe that big shifts can be made. Huge.
Oh my gosh, that's so awesome. I mean, I feel
You're
the
making
same
me
way.
laugh.
It's it's so funny because it's like if I even looked back on the person that I was 10, 15
Oh my
years ago
gosh, right?
and the person that I am now, it's just it's mind-blowing. And I'm so grateful for it. And I'm so grateful for you because it's like here's how I know how well matched we are. I just feel like we just spent 47 minutes vibrating at the highest frequency. We just like nailed some amazingly powerful topics. And at the end of the day, the topic today is dealing with difficult employees. And I think, when we're really being honest with ourselves, there is so much difficulty outside of us. But when we start to reflect more from within, we are going to be able to just nail this toxicity that's outside of us in a way that I think both of us in this conversation,
Yes.
clearly we can see have blown our own minds, right?
Yes.
And I think
Yes.
blowing our own minds is now something that I think we should all aspire to.
Yes. Yeah. And and I love that we, at the time of this recording, we do this every Monday live, 8 o'clock Mountain Time, 7 o'clock Pacific. What is that? 10 o'clock Eastern Time. And I really believe that spending this time with you every single morning is setting the tone for the rest of my week. As you just said, we're operating at that higher vibration. And
Mhm.
for me, that really impacts the rest of my day. That impacts the rest of my week. And I just hope that it gives some inspiration to all of our listeners that, how we show up and our power move is all in our brain. That really is, we can't always change our external circumstances, but we can change is our approach. And we can start approaching HR in a super empowered way. So Jen, thank you so much for the wisdom you continue to impart. I love your articulation of everything. You inspire me every single Monday. And I'm so grateful to have this time with you. So thank
Oh
you.
my gosh, thank you. Like it goes right back to you. And again, this is exactly why I think that we are so destined for this. I feel the same way. It's starting off Mondays with you, with
Yes.
this podcast, having such amazing conversations that continue to crack me open. There is nothing I would more want to do. So
I know.
oh, well, thank you. Now, next week, do we know what's coming up?
Asking for help is the essential HR skill.
Asking for help.
Asking for help. So how do we develop that skill, especially when people are constantly coming to us? How often, if we're really being honest with ourselves, do we neglect to ask for help as HR people? So that's what we're going to talk about next week, which I think is huge.
Looking forward to it.
Me too. Me too.
All right.
Yeah. Thanks, Jen. And to all of our listeners, just remember every single day is a great day to thrive and shine in HR. We'll see you next week.